Mr Speaker.
Stuart Nash.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I'm pleased to be able to take a first reading call on this, but there are a couple of points, Mr Speaker, that I do think need clarification. Amy Adams stood up here and said that Michael Cullen was incompetent. Imagine saying the man that delivered 9 budgets, all in surplus, is incompetent. Well, Mr Speaker, if Dr Cullen was so incompetent, then why did that government appoint him to the board of New Zealand Post and Kiwi Bank? That's a disgrace to say Michael Cullen was incompetent. It's a disgrace. In fact, as Ms Adams knows, as Mr Foss knows, the reason why this economy has done okay compared to a lot of the global economies is because Dr Cullen banked surplus after surplus and put money away for a rainy day. And by goodness me, Mr Speaker, when it poured down in the global financial crisis, thank goodness Michael Cullen had the foresight to understand how the New Zealand economy worked. And that is the reason why Michael Cullen left this country with no sovereign debt. Amy Adams also accused me of economic literacy, Mr Speaker. Well, Mr Speaker, she shouldn't accuse me of that. I think what she needs to do is talk to the Minister. Those weren't my facts that were quoted yesterday, Mr Speaker. Those facts were provided by the Minister of Revenue. All I was doing, Mr Speaker, was outlining to the people of New Zealand the facts that had been given to me. In fact, Mr Speaker, I did interpret them. I looked at the facts, and I looked at the black and white facts, and they were as plain as day, Mr Speaker. We have a rural sector that is either A, in dire straits, and we need to have that debate as a nation, because the agricultural sector holds itself up as the backbone of this country. And I tend to think it is a very important part of our economy. But it pays no tax, Mr Speaker, according to the figures provided to me by the Minister of Revenue. They pay no tax. Not my figures. Or, Mr Speaker, there is something inherently wrong with the tax system where farmers are claiming back a whole lot of expenses that perhaps they shouldn't be. I don't know what the answer is. All I do know is that the dairy industry in the last financial year paid $26 million in tax. And I ask the question, is that fair? And then Mr Foss stood up. Mr Foss stood up and waxed lyrical for about a minute around what a wonderful speech his Prime Minister had delivered. What a psychopath. It made me sick. In fact, I find it quite insulting that Mr Key simply does not take this House seriously. He treats it with the disrespect. I think it is dreadful. In fact, I find it quite insulting, Mr Speaker, and I think a lot of MPs who have done a significant amount of time in this House, if they had listened to Mr Key's speech, if they had listened to the Prime Minister's speech, they would have been insulted. And then David Bennett stood up. Oh, David Bennett. And he said that Kiwis are better off because interest rates are lower. Well, Mr Speaker, the unemployment rate is double now than it was when Michael Cullen wrote his last budget. How can Mr Bennett say that New Zealanders are better off when there are 150,000 New Zealanders are on the unemployment benefit? Mr Speaker, New Zealanders are not better off. Mr Bennett said that New Zealanders are better off because they're saving more. Well, the facts show us that if you earned over $1 million, you got $1,000 worth of tax cuts. You are better off in that respect. But if you're on the average wage, then you are not better off. And we have to keep in mind that 75% of New Zealanders earn below the average wage. Sir Roger Douglas criticised Labour for beating up the wealthy. No, Sir Roger, we do not beat up the wealthy. The Labour Party is a party for equity and a party for fairness. That is all we demand on behalf of the people of New Zealand. Fairness and equity. That is all we ask for. Mr. Speaker, there are 3 more points I would like to make. Good, hard-working New Zealanders have been let down by this government. By cutting KiwiSaver and working for families, the government disadvantages the whole economy. And the third point is there is no plan behind these figures. Mr. Speaker, all the people of New Zealand were looking for was a plan. Is that too much to ask for? A plan for growth, a plan for economic recovery, a plan for our families and a plan for our future. They didn't got a plan. They got a whole lot of words that fell through a hole as large as Africa and ended up in China, because that's where our jobs are going unless we start investing in R&D, in the productive economy, and our people. Mr. Speaker, 10 million cubic metres worth of logs are being exported to China, while sawmills in New Zealand are closing down. We are becoming more and more of a commodity economy because this government is not investing in our productive sector. Where are the policies to help our companies, our exporters and our workers to drive up productivity? They did not exist because that government does not have a plan to drive economic growth. The government crowed last year how they had invested in ECE. Well, Mr. Speaker, the Napier Kindergarten Association had $570,000 cut from its budget. And Mr. Tremaine had the nerve to come and tell them at their AGM how much money the government had invested in ECE. Well, he was told, unknown to circumstances, they had $570,000 cut. And the Hastings Kindergarten Association, Mr. Foss, had over $500,000 cut from their budget as well. Is that fair? No, it's not. So what do the people of New Zealand get? They got cuts and cuts and cuts. And that is simply not fair. Cuts to KiwiSaver. Who does that hurt? Who does that hurt? Hard-working New Zealanders who are saving for their retirement, doing the responsible thing, putting money away, and $10 a week adds up. It adds up. Mr. Gilmore knows it adds up over time. If you put away $10 a week extra into your savings account now when you're 25, by the time you retire, that will be a substantial amount of money, won't it, Mr. Gilmore? This isn't what the Savings Working Group said. The Savings Working Group said it is time New Zealanders started to save. This budget does not do that. Cuts for working for family. Who does that hurt? Families that are already facing dire economic circumstances, Mr. Speaker. In Hawke's Bay, working for families pumps about $120 million into the economy. I don't know how much money this will have taken out, but cutting working for families for Hawke's Bay families will not only hurt those families that are struggling, it will hurt the economy of Hawke's Bay. Mr. Speaker, under this government, the people of the Bay are going backwards. Mr. Speaker, all the people of New Zealand were looking for was a plan. Is that too much to ask for? Was that too much to ask for, Mr. Speaker? Well, it's interesting. Mr. Foss talks about the mortgage rate. Why didn't he do something about monetary policy? Why didn't the government give the Reserve Bank the tools to have an influence over the exchange rate and therefore over the interest rate? They didn't do a thing. They didn't do a thing. They crow about the interest rate, and the only reason the interest rate is as low as it is because the economy is tanking. And Mr. Foss knows that. Mr. Foss knows that. Mr. Speaker, there's just one last thing I would like to say. There is a discrepancy of $4 billion in the revenue forecast between the IRD and the Treasury. The IRD over 5 years. Page 81, a discrepancy of $4 billion, and the government's gone with the Treasury figures. And then the government says, and I quote, the lower forecasts of tax revenue from inland revenue indicate there may be some downside risk to our tax forecast. Well, that is the understatement of the decade. That is the understatement of the decade. The government does not listen to the inland revenue. It listens to the Treasury when the Treasury continuously gets it wrong. Mr Speaker, this was a budget that had absolutely no plan for the people of New Zealand, no vision for this economy, and it is a disgrace and it is simply not fair.
Mr Speaker, it gives me enormous